Hello and welcome once again to this class. For this lesson, we are going to look at the life and works of J.F. Handel. The life and works of J.F. Handel. Handel happens to be one of the musical colossus that lived. He contributed so much to music. I want to look at his life and what made him popular, who was he, and what are his compositions. His works are included the opera, which is a play or drama, usually where everything is sung, and equally did the oratorio, which is a choral work based on the sacred text from the Bible. It's just that for the oratorio, it is not acted. So these were his major works. He equally wrote some concertos for piano and for some other musical instruments. Now we will take time to look at each of these and many more and his contributions to music. Now I want to look at who is J.F. Handel. What made him so popular? What impact did he make in music? His compositions, his works, and the defining moments of his life and career. These are what we are going to look. So in doing this, we are going to go to Piano TV for this lesson.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Piano TV. I'm Alicia, your host, and today we are going to take a look at the composer named Handel. Now, Handel and Bach are intricately tied in discussions about music history. They were both Baroque masters. They were both even born in the same year, in 1685. We've also done an entire history of Bach, if you want to check that out. But we're going to talk about Handel today, and he is a well-known composer in his own right, but in some senses he is dead in Bach's shadow. But in the early 1700s, he was just as well known as Bach, perhaps even more so. So in today's video, we are going to talk about Handel's life, some drama, some of the music that he wrote, his personality, all that good stuff. Let's get started. Handel was born in 1685 in Halle, Germany, though he spent most of his life in London, England. As we already mentioned, that was actually the same year that Bach was born in, and another Baroque master named Scarlatti, which is just a really neat little detail. Handel was a multi-talented musician and wrote in a variety of genres, being particularly well known for his operas and oratorios. He actually wrote over 40 operas in 30 years, which is just mind-blowingly productive. That'd be like writing, producing, and recording 1 or 2 movies a year, but with all the music writing thrown in there also. I don't know if that's a good example or not. Unlike some other composers, Handel lived a relatively long life too. He died at age 74 in 1759. And he also died wealthy and respectable instead of in poverty. Handel Jr. was born to Handel Sr.'s second wife, along with 2 other girls. Handel Sr. took a lot of pains to make sure that the young Handel was prevented from ever having a musical education because he must have showed some aptitude at an early age. According to Handel biographer Mainwaring, Handel found means to get a little clavichord privately conveyed to a room at the top of the house. To this room, he constantly stole when the family was asleep. When Handel was quite young, he went on a trip with his father to Weissenfels. When at the Palace Chapel of the Holy Trinity, Handel wandered over to the court organ and impressed everyone with his playing, including Duke Johann Adolf I. The Duke suggested to Handel's father that he get a music education, and that wasn't something that Handel's father could actually refuse, even if he'd wanted to. That led Handel to his first and only teacher, Friedrich Wilhelm Zachow. Zachow taught Handel organ in the old school style, full of fugues and counterpoint, as well as integrating styles from Italy and other countries. In addition to learning the organ, Handel also studied the violin, the harpsichord, and especially the oboe. Handel actually wrote quite a few compositions for the oboe in his lifetime since he was so fond of it. One common teaching practice at that time was to copy out sheet music by hand in order to study the score. And it's basically like, think about, doing math problems in a workbook, but you're writing out sheet music in order to learn. So Handel's music teacher got him to write out all of this music by hand, and that is one way that Handel learned. Zachow was also a bit of a partier and a drinker, so Handel ended up taking over quite a bit of the organist duties that were Zechow's at an early age. This included writing weekly services for church, and that is like a giant undertaking because you're creating essentially like an hour's worth of music on a weekly basis. Handel Sr. died when Handel Jr. was 12 years old in 1697. And in 1702, perhaps as a nod to his father obsessed with medicine, Handel enrolled in the University of Halle. He was also the organist at the Cathedral of Halle, which was no small feat for a young man since it was such a prestigious position. Around this time, Handel at university also met another Baroque legend, Telemann. Telemann was just 4 years older than Handel. Like, let's take a minute. Why Telemann, Bach, and Handel, why were they all born? And Scarlatti too. They were all born within like 5 years of each other, which is very wild. Handel was studying law at the university, and so was Telemann. The two quickly bonded, becoming friends, Telemann reminiscing in future writings about how him and Handel would spend many hours analyzing the music of John Kuhnau, and how the two men just, bonded, spent lots of time together, they wrote each other letters, etc. Handel later traveled to Hamburg in search of bigger and better things. Telemann had sparked in him an interest in secular music, and Hamburg provided more of an opportunity for a fledgling musician. Here he played as the harpsichordist and violinist in the orchestra. He also began writing his first operas, Elmira and Nero, in 1705. He began traveling through Italy and writing Italian opera. Agrippina, written in 1709, was a huge hit, running for almost a month straight, and the audience was thunderstruck with the grandeur and sublimity of his style. Handel enjoyed success and had a stint as Kapellmeister to German Prince George, who would then go on to become King George I in England. After writing the famous opera Rinaldo, Handel decided to move on to England, where he would remain for the rest of his life, becoming a naturalized citizen. Handel had earned his way into aristocratic circles and had some wealthy patrons, such as Queen Anne and the 3rd Earl of Burlington and the 4th Earl of Cork. Handel wrote the famous water music for King George I, which was performed outdoors to much pomp and ceremony. This is one of his earliest instrumental suites. This composition helped Handel and King George I reconcile. Apparently, George was salty when Handel decided to quit being his Kapellmeister and move to England, but all's well that ends well. Handel then became the house composer at Cannons. In this era, musicians were often sponsored by wealthy patrons and would live in an estate to provide all of that estate's music services. This is where Aces and Galatea for the first Duke of Chandos was composed, and it became one of Handel's most performed works in his lifetime. Handel started an opera company called the Royal Academy of Music in 1719, of which the Duke of Chandos was an important patron. Handel then moved out of Cannons to a house on 25 Brook Street, where he would live for the rest of his life. Nowadays, it's actually the Handel House Museum. He amassed a variety of musicians for this opera company. He wrote some of his best operas, including Julius Caesar and Tamerlano. Handel wrote Zadok the Priest for King George II's coronation in 1729, and it's been played in every English coronation since. Handel eventually took over the Queen's Theatre in 1729 when the Royal Academy of Music ceased. He continued writing operas like a madman, including his very first English operas, Esther and Deborah. His contract with the Queen's Theatre ended in 1733, and at this point everyone expected him to retire, but Handel wasn't the type. Instead, he sought out another opera house, Covent Garden Theatre, and then he continued pumping out operas. In 1737, at the age of 52, Handel suffered a stroke, and that ended up basically immobilizing 4 out of 5 of his fingers. I guess the thumb's not technically a finger, on his right hand. And when this happened, people were like, okay, Handel has got to be retiring now. Not so much. After his stroke, he spent 6 weeks in Aachen, Germany at a spa, and he did this in order to heal and recover. And afterwards, he played the organ again to a very surprised audience. And after that, he wrote one of his most famous operas, Circe. Deidamia was his final opera, and that was written in 1741. After that, Handel decided to move on to a new and exciting genre, the oratorio. Handel became drawn toward oratorios partly for their financial return. He could ditch the elaborate costumes and performances, of opera and have some English singers, which would then appeal to English audiences. Alexander's Feast was one of Handel's first successful oratorios in 1736, and it was the transitional work that prompted him to end up moving away from opera because it went so well. Messiah was then performed in 1742, and that secured Handel as a legend of choral writing. Later on, we had Solomon, another well-known oratorio of Handel's in 1749, but there are countless others. In a follow-up sequel to Water Music, Handel wrote music for the royal fireworks in 1749 to a massive audience of 12,000 people. He then followed that up with a 1750 performance of Messiah as a benefit for a children's hospital, which he ended up doing annually until the end of his life. He also gave to charity to help out poor musicians. It was also in 1750 when the fated carriage accident happened when Handel was traveling in the Netherlands. This led to a chain of events in which his eye was failing, so he ended up getting eye surgery by the notorious John Taylor, which just really messed up his eye, and he was basically completely blind by 1752. He died in 1759 at the age of 74 at home. And then he was buried in Westminster Abbey, where there was a huge turnout of people. Over 3,000 people came to pay their respects. Handel was really well respected by other musicians of the day and just by the general public. He never lost his esteem. Bach really wanted to meet him, for example, but never quite got the chance before Handel passed away. Mozart said, "Handel understands affect better than any of us. When he chooses, he strikes like a thunderbolt." According to Beethoven, Handel was the master of us all, the greatest composer that ever lived. I would uncover my head and kneel before his tomb. Beethoven also said, "Go to him to learn how to achieve great effects by such simple means." As is wont to happen, Handel's compositions fell into obscurity shortly after his death just because they became perceived as old-fashioned. Now, there were composers such as Mozart who loved Handel's compositions and revitalized them by reworking them, by altering the arrangements and such. But for the most part, Handel's operas disappeared until more recently. His oratorios never really disappeared. They've always kind of had a tradition, especially in England. And in the 20th century, there was a revised interest in Baroque music in general, in which case Handel's music has really surfaced again, including his opera. We really don't know much about Handel's personal life, so we can make a lot of speculations. For example, he never married and he was a flamboyant theater man, so one can make assumptions as to why he never married, but you know what they say about assuming. We also don't know very much about Handel's personal life because of how long ago he lived, and there just aren't very good records. But I think the biggest part of it is that he was a professional through and through. He kept his private life very private. He wasn't the kind of person to wear his heart on his sleeve in any sense. A few things that we do know is that he was very wealthy. He had an impressive art collection in his home. He was charitable towards the end of his life, and he left a large majority of his estate to his niece Johanna. As for his personality, we know that it was a big one. And it wasn't just his personality that was big. Handel was a big, fiery man, and he was quick to anger, but also quick to forgiveness. He experienced his emotions very, very quickly. He was also fond of the finer things in life, including good food and good drink. Handel was a really savvy businessman who managed to pave a way for himself in a business he was not born into, unlike, for example, Bach. Bach was a born musician, born into a musical family. Not only was Handel not even born into this business, but he managed to stay relevant for 50 odd years. Again, a very impressive feat when other musicians were disappearing into obscurity. Handel was constantly reinventing himself. For example, going from opera to oratorio in order to keep with the times. He was incredibly productive. He composed over 600 works, and these aren't short works. Like, a lot of these would be entire operas. And again, we know that Handel was charitable, particularly towards the end of his life. So he had to be a good guy, especially because he was so beloved, and they wouldn't have loved him so much if it was just his music that was good. He had to have had a warm personality that drew people in. But we're getting into speculative territory. That's all we really know. I hope you enjoyed this brief history of Handel, and stay tuned for the next month or so. We're going to be releasing several more Handel related videos, including a music analysis. We're going to listen to some of Handel's music. We're going to look at what some good ones to start learning on the piano would be, and so on. So definitely check those out. I'll catch you in the next one.